Now it's time to look at the third move, bishop to b2. With bishop b2, white keeps some options open, whether he wants to play knight to f3 or d4 or a3 next. It would be possible for black to play d5 now, but instead I will suggest to play knight f6. The reason for that is that after d5, white will take on d5, we recapture with the queen, and then white plays knight f3, because black was threatening to play e5. After knight c6, white could transpose to the main line with a3, but he can also play the very annoying move c4, hitting the queen. If we now retreat to d8, white can follow up with d4 and then push d5. If we instead take on c3, white can recapture with a knight, hitting the queen, and when the queen moves, white will again play d4 and follow it up with d5, which means white has some compensation for the pawn. So instead, after bishop to b2, I suggest to play knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4. Now, the most critical try for white is to play e5, of course. But white can also try to defend e4 with a tactical trick, bishop c4. The idea is that after knight takes e4, white wants to capture on f7 with check, king takes f7, queen h5 check, king g8, all those moves are basically forced, queen to d5, double attack against the king and the knight, and after e6, queen takes e4, we reach a position where black can either play knight c6 or d5. I suggest we play knight c6 here. Yes, black's king is a little bit misplaced on g8 and the rook on h8 is a little bit stuck. But black is up a pawn and also he can play d5 later on and try to occupy the center. Also moves like bishop e7, bishop f6 to neutralize the bishop on b2 is possible, and in addition to that he even has the bishop pair. So this position should be clearly better for black, and fourth move bishop c4 isn't a good idea. Which means that after knight f6 the critical move is e5 and we play knight d5. Now white basically has the choice between two pawn structures you can play. He can either play with c4 or he can play with a3. He can play those moves immediately or delay playing them and instead opt for something like knight f3 or bishop c4 first. Let's see what happens if white plays c4 immediately. After c4, we capture en passant, and white has two options. He can take with the knight or the pawn on c3. If he takes with the pawn on c3, we can play the very strong move queen to b6. Now we are hitting the bishop on b2, and it is rather awkward for white to defend the bishop, because if he uses this queen to defend it, he will not have an attack on the d5 knight anymore, and moving the bishop is also not in white's best interest. So this position should be pretty good for black. Instead, after b takes c3, white might try to play knight takes c3, attacking the knight on d5, so we capture on c3, bishop takes c3, and now I suggest we play a light square strategy with e6, and after knight f3 we go b6. We can either go bishop a6, exchange the bishops, then follow it up with knight a6, c7 to d5, or we can bring the bishop to b7, and then later on maybe knight c6, bishop e7 and castle short. In this position, black is up a pawn and I don't see the compensation for white. If white instead opts for a3 instead of c4, I suggest we play the move d6. And as a rule of thumb, I would suggest to always play d6 after a3. Don't play d6 before white has played a3. There is a tactical reason for that, which I will explain later on. But after a3, I say we play d6, and then go for knight c6, and if white plays knight f3, we can go for bishop to g4. Eventually playing e6, and trying to play bishop e7 and castle short later on. White can also handle this position similar to an Alapin, and after knight d5, he can play the move bishop to c4, trying to bring the bishop on the diagonal a2 to g8 and hitting f7. Here, as a rule of thumb, I suggest to go knight b6, driving the bishop back to b3, and then always go for the a5, a4 push. After a5, black is threatening to play a4, winning the bishop on b3. So white has two options. He can either play a4 or a3. Since a4 rather closes the game for white, he will most likely instead play a3. We push forward to a4, and after the first move bishop to a2, I suggest we play knight c6. The idea is that black is protecting the pawn on b4, and if white should ever take on b4, we can recapture on b4 and then win the bishop on a2. A future plan of development for black in this position might be to play the move d5, and if white plays, for example, knight f3, try to develop the bishop to g4, followed by e6, bishop e7, and castling short. Let's return to knight to d5. Usually after knight d5, white doesn't show his cards with c4 or bishop c4 or even a3, and usually he plays knight f3. After this move, black has basically two options. He can either go with knight c6 and wait for white to commit to some pawn structure after c4 or a3, or he could play d6. But after d6 there is a problem, because white can now play c4. We are basically forced to capture on c3 en passant. Knight takes c3, knight takes c3, bishop takes c3. And yes, black is up a pawn, but white is ahead in development. And it is a bit annoying for black that he cannot easily castle in this position. For example, if he plays now e6, white will capture on d6, and black cannot capture on d6 with his bishop because of bishop takes g7, which means that d6 runs into some concrete problems. So instead, I suggest to play knight c6. Again, bishop c4 can be answered with knight b6, bishop b3, and the same idea with a5, a4, while the move a3 can now be answered with d6. Now there is a difference. If white plays with c4, we can capture en passant, and after knight takes c3, we can capture on e5, which means that c4 in the current position isn't working, but please note that d6 was only played after white had already committed with the move a3. There's also the option of playing a takes b4 for white. Here I suggest to recapture with the knight from d5. The idea now for black is to play the move bishop to f5, hitting c2. So most likely white will play a move like c3, kick back the knight, but blocking his bishop on b2. So we go back to d5. Now white can try to play for a quick c4 followed by d4 and d5. So for example, here he can play c4 or he can play d4. After d4, we can go bishop to f5. And if white plays now c4, we transpose to the other line with c4. And if white doesn't play c4 immediately, we can go for e6 and then try to develop with bishop to e7 and castle short. So let's look at the more forcing line after knight d5, which is c4. Here we go knight to b4. Again, we are intending to play bishop to f5. And white goes for the d4, d5 push. And this is hard to stop for black. He can play d5 immediately, but I suggest to throw in a bishop f5 with a knight c2 threat and forking king and rook. So white is basically forced to play knight a3 to cover c2. And after that, I suggest to play d5. And here it seems white has no forcing lines that give him any compensation. Black will most likely play e6, bishop e7, and then castle short. So black is clearly better in this position. Let's return to d6. In this position, white can again go for the bishop c4 idea. Again, we go knight b6, hitting the bishop. And as soon as the bishop drops back to b3, we again go for the a5, a4 idea. Now white can ignore the a5, a4 idea in this position by castling, because he has the square a2 for his bishop. So after a4, he can drop back to a2. And he might claim that it is a little bit awkward for black to develop, since whenever black plays e6, white can capture on d6 and then the g7 pawn is under fire. So in the current position, I suggest to play d5, then trying to play bishop to g4 or to f5, followed by e6. And white has hardly any compensation for the pawn. This means that after a5, white might not want to allow black to close the position with a4 followed by d5. So instead he might take now on d6. Again, I suggest to play a4, because if white now takes on e7, we can capture on e7 with check and then win the bishop on b3. So white is forced to play bishop a2 here. Now black could capture on d6 or play e6. The problem in both cases is that the bishop is very strong on b2. So instead I suggest to sacrifice the g7 pawn with the following line. E takes d6, white will castle in this position. And here I suggest to go for bishop e7. If white doesn't capture now on g7, we will either castle short or play bishop f6 and be clearly better. So white is basically forced to take on g7. We are also forced to play rook g8 now. Now the bishop on g7 is hanging, so the only sensible square for this piece is b2 again. Now we can exploit the open g-file and go bishop h3. g3 is now not possible because of bishop takes f1. So the only sensible move for white is to play knight e1, protecting g2. And here I suggest we play queen to d7. We are threatening to take on g2, and if white recaptures on g2, we'll play queen to h3, followed by queen takes g2 with checkmate. If white somehow parries that threat, we can continue with d5 to block out the bishop on a2 and also castling long. All in all, I would say that the king on c8 from black is much safer than the king on g1 for white, because of the half-open g-file. This should cover the third move, bishop to b2.